Hello BookTube, and welcome to another weekly reading vlog. This week I've been reading these three books. The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood by Howard Pyle. The Story of King Arthur and His Knights, also by Howard Pyle. And The Linguistic Wars by Randy Allen Harris. So, The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood by Howard Pyle. I actually finished it before, and I was just rereading some of it while I was working on my review, which amounted to not much this week. I reread 9 pages, from page 10 to page 19. Actually, 8 pages. I usually count the page numbers by the left-hand page. 8 pages. And then I did give a review of this book earlier this week. So I have filmed my review of this book and published it, posted it, and I am done with this book now. So no more The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood. And after I finished that, I picked up The Story of King Arthur and His Knights by Howard Pyle, which I started this week, and am so far 54 pages into it. Yes, so I filmed a video earlier this week in which I talked about starting this book, and talked about my previous experiences with the King Arthur story, which has not been extensive. I read The Once and Future King by T.H. White about 6 years ago now, I think. 6 or 7 years ago. And while I was reading The Once and Future King, if you're not familiar with it, The Once and Future King is essentially just a retelling of The Death of Arthur, or La Mort d'Arthur by Thomas Malory. So while I was reading The Once and Future King, I did make an attempt to get through The Death of Arthur because it piqued my interest. But I regret to say I didn't stick with it. But I did flip through it. I read some sections and I maybe had some general idea of it. It's all a bit foggy in my memory now, though. So that's going to be maybe a reoccurring theme if I try and discuss this book in terms of what I remember from the other books. I don't know, maybe I should just discuss this book on its own. The first few chapters here talked about the famous sword in the stone incident, when King Arthur pulls the sword out of the stone. Now, I believe, somebody correct me if I'm wrong here, I believe until T.H. White wrote his book, The Sword in the Stone, which the Disney movie was based off of, I believe up until then nobody had made an attempt to cover the boyhood of King Arthur. Again, somebody correct me if I'm getting this wrong. So that T.H. White book, The Sword in the Stone, and then the Disney movie of which it is based, is not based on any of the ancient or medieval legends about King Arthur, except for that last part where he pulls the sword out of the stone. The Disney movie, The Sword in the Stone, I actually remember very well because I've watched it over and over and over again as a youngster to the point of memorization. And also I think my memory was just better when I was younger. Stuff I watched or read when I was younger seems to have imprinted itself more than stuff I read or watch when I'm older. I think that's just the way the brain works, maybe. Same for a lot of people, I'm assuming. So I remember that Disney version perfectly. And of course, you remember in the Disney version, Kay, Arthur's older brother, is a real jerk. He's playing the part of the ugly stepsister, except he's the stepbrother. Now, if memory serves, he was not a jerk in T.H. White's book. And he's not really a jerk in this book either. he's a valiant knight, and he's competing in a tournament, and Arthur is really glad to be his page. I think it's called page or squire. And there's no indication that he's mistreating his younger brother at all, like he is in the Disney version. But then when Arthur does pull the sword out of the stone, or out of the anvil, and brings it to Kay, then Kay does get tempted by the idea to try and claim that he was the one who took it out of the stone himself, because Arthur is so naive, Arthur is so naive, he doesn't realize what he's done. So then Kay wants to claim it as his own. And it's an interesting little moment here, because it doesn't seem to have much dramatic payoff, at least in this book. They go back to the anvil. Sir Ector, their father, tries to get Kay to do it again. Kay can't do it again, and then Arthur does it. And there's no this moment of weakness where Kay tries to claim the sword as his own. Excuse me. Tries to claim the kingship as his own. Doesn't really seem to come back. And then Kay and his father go on to serve King Arthur. Then there's a brief section on the winning of the kinghood, which, if memory serves, was described more extensively in The Once and Future King, and the bits of, even more extensively, I believe, in La Mort de Arthur, the death of Arthur. Here it's really just skimmed over very briefly, saying Arthur had some famous battles with some other kings, but eventually he consolidated control of the kingdom. And then with that aside, it goes right into the more fairy tale-esque quests of Arthur and his knights, of which I'm on the first one here, the winning of a sword. So King Arthur and his men are going into this forest. It's not exactly clear why they're traveling through a forest, but as they're resting under some trees, then a wounded knight comes with his page, and they tend to the wounded knight, and they hear the whole story of how he got wounded. I've got to say, after having read Don Quixote, it's a little bit hard to immerse yourself maybe in these medieval romances again. These, I believe they're called chivalric romances, because I keep thinking of all the things that Don Quixote makes fun of. Like this knight who got wounded, he was just wandering looking for adventure, which is what Don Quixote was doing. Don Quixote had this idea that if he just wandered, and Don Quixote's idea of wandering was just sitting on his horse and letting the horse just go wherever the horse wanted to go, that would be the appropriate way to find adventure. But yeah, sure enough, you can see where he gets that from, because in this book, the knight is just wandering. It was a fine spring day, and the knight just decided to go off and wander in search of adventure, like that being how people found adventures in these types of stories. And then he's in the forest, and then they come to a valley in the forest, and there's this beautiful castle in the valley with these three fair, beautiful maidens playing with a golden ball outside the castle, and they tell the knight to go and, if he wants to seek adventure, to follow this path which leads to this stone bridge over a stream. And there's another castle on the other side where there's this beautiful yard, and on the apple tree of that yard is all the shields that the knight has already defeated. And yeah, again, you can see where this would fit right in with Don Quixote's delusions, because of course it would, because Don Quixote was written with these stories in mind that Cervantes was satirizing. And yeah, there's even a scene here where one of King Arthur's young squires wants to become a knight so he can avenge this sable knight who's wounding everybody. And he's not a knight yet, so he has to stay overnight guarding his armor in a chapel. Apparently there's a chapel in this forest. So there's a chapel in the forest, and he's guarding his armor in this chapel in this forest all night. And then he becomes a knight, and then he can ride out to challenge the other knight. So, you can definitely see where Cervantes got a lot of mileage milking this stuff. Cervantes got a lot of mileage mocking this stuff. On the other hand, reading this, you do think it's almost too easy to make fun of. I mean, as brilliant as Cervantes was, when you're reading these myths, you think, well, I mean, of course they're completely fantastical. And if you wanted to deconstruct them and say how ridiculous it would be if somebody took them seriously, that's almost too easy. But then, I don't know. It's a little bit like The Watchmen. You could say, well, of course these comic books are ridiculous. And it's almost a little bit too easy to make fun of them and deconstruct them. And yet, I don't know, the Watchmen can still be quite entertaining to read. And Don Quixote, if you saw my review of Don Quixote, my main complaint is that it just went on forever and ever and ever. But that doesn't mean it wasn't good fun at parts. It just went on way too long, is my main complaint. So Don Quixote can be good fun to read if it wasn't so long, making fun of this stuff. But I do have to admit, I find myself, I quite like these old romances here, these old chivalric romances. Even though it's hard not to think about Don Quixote when you're reading them, and all the stuff Don Quixote would have made fun of, they are, they're not meant to be taken seriously, and they are just meant to evoke this sense of dreamlike wonder, or kind of a fairy tale wonder, where you're wandering through this forest, and within this forest are all these mystical, magical things, like a beautiful valley of delight with this beautiful garden and these three beautiful maidens all within the forest. And then, he finds all these strange castles and buildings, and what else does he find? He finds, he finds these charcoal burners plying their trade in the middle of the forest. Who knows? Maybe in medieval times, when all the forests weren't cut down, that there was a bit more activity going on in the forest, but I doubt it. It just seems like the whole thing is a fairy tale. But then letting yourself go with that fairy tale and being transported and imagining all these, the stream and the stone bridge and all this picturesque stuff in the forest is part of the appeal of a book like this. So only 50 pages into it, but I've been enjoying it and will be continuing on. And then the Linguistic Wars. So when I last left off last week, I only had 10 pages left to read. These 10 pages here. The rest of this here is all endnotes, and there are a lot of endnotes in this book. It's one of those books where you have to keep flipping to the back to see the endnotes, and then the works cited section and the index, etc. But of the main text, there was only 10 pages left to read, and I finished those 10 pages. So I can talk about them. He's talking, the last 10 pages are a bit of an epilogue. Let's see, maybe I'll grab the camera here. The last 10 pages are an epilogue in which he's talking about what happened to the participants of the Linguistic Wars. Now, this book was published in 1993, And I believe it's still in print. I had no problems ordering it from my local bookstore 4 years ago. I was just on Amazon today checking it out. It looks like you can easily order it off of Amazon. I think actually it might still be being used as required reading in universities, which would explain why they charge so much for it. I mean, I had to pay $50 for it when I special ordered it. You know, because students, of course, are a captive market once it's required reading at a course. So it's still in print, I believe, even though it was published in 1993. But, I mean, you do have to seek it out. It won't be like at an airport bookstore or anything like that, but still in print. But, yeah, it would be interesting. He kind of sums up what's happened with the different theories and the participants and talks about where are they now. And it would be interesting to see how this might have changed if it were written now in 2021, because I imagine a lot of this is dated now or new information has come out. But he talks about so the legacy of the generative semantics, the legacy of generative semantics, the greening of linguistics, and talks about how even though the generative semantics movement kind of imploded on itself, it sparked a lot of different research and a lot of different interests and a lot of different subdivisions in linguistics, whereas before it had been quite narrowly focused. After the Linguistic Wars, there was a lot more research being done in a lot more areas, so he calls that the greening of linguistics. And then the legacy of generative semantics 2, the right of salvage. So he talks about after generative semantics imploded on itself, a whole lot of other people started using their ideas, including Chomsky and Chomsky's school, which is called, what again? The interpretive semantics, I believe is the name for Chomsky's faction. And he talks a little bit about the ethics of adapting other people's ideas in science. The generative semanticists are quite upset about this, but the author implies that this is kind of how science has already functioned. Sorry, kind of how science has always functioned, I mean to say. And that there's no use getting upset about it. And then Whither Chomsky. So this book has tried its best to be fair to both sides of the linguistic wars. And by fair, I mean to be equally critical. So the author has had a number of critical things to say about Chomsky. For example, Chomsky seems to delight in antagonistic science, and perhaps it's Chomsky's influence that things have been so antagonistic in linguistics over the past 40 or 50 years. And Chomsky initially seemed to oppose generative semantics without really much of a theoretical basis. At least at the beginning, the theoretical basis did come later, but initially it just seemed like a knee-jerk hostility to anyone who wasn't part of his theory. But then at the end, he does have a lot of praise for Chomsky, while acknowledging that there are a whole lot of linguists who still hate his guts. And again, mainly as a legacy of the Linguistic Wars. But he says, even though Chomsky has changed his mind so many times and gone through so many different theories or variations of his theories over the years, he's still an incredible genius and so creative. And it's part of his creativity that all these multitudes of theories have come out of him, even though the theories are always evolving and always changing. So, he's not, if you're looking for him to get it right the first time, certainly that's not what Chomsky has done. But praise for Chomsky's intellect and creativity at the end. And then we come to the end here, and the rest is just notes. Now, I'm going to be preparing a review of this in the next few weeks, and during that time I'll be rereading the first few chapters as I do, and I might be talking about those further in other weekly reading vlogs. But I have come to the end of my first reading of this book. So I actually have a little bit of extra time left today to talk about the podcasts I've been listening to, which are The History of Rome by Mike Duncan. I'm on my third time listening through to it. And I actually, for various reasons, have had probably more podcasting time this week than reading time. I've had a lot of work to do in which it was easy to put on a podcast while I was doing the work or exercise. So I've been working my way through those. I was up to, at the beginning of the week, this part on Vespasian. And so we went through Vespasian and his two sons, Titus and Domitian. Domitian is somebody I really didn't know much about before starting this podcast, because I